200 days and nights. A city wiped off the face of the earth, but not conquered. A river burning with fire. A place where one army found its death and another found its immortality. This is not just a battle. This is Stalingrad. This is the story of how the backbone of the Wehrmacht was broken in the ruins of a single city, and the fate of World War II was decided. Today, we will tell you the price that was paid for this victory and why this name has become an eternal symbol of the greatest feat in history. The summer of 1942, in the endless expanses of the southern steppes, scorched white by the sun, the fate of not just a country, but the entire world was being decided. The Great Patriotic War, which had already lasted a year, was entering a new and possibly most terrible phase. After the Red Army's winter counteroffensive near Moscow faltered and the spring operations ended in heavy defeats, the strategic initiative once again fell into the hands of the German command. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with the idea of crushing the Soviet Union before the next winter, turned his gaze to the south. It was here, in his opinion, that the key to final victory lay. Directive number 41, signed by him in April, launched a large-scale plan codenamed Fall Blau, or Blue Option. The objectives of this plan were grandiose and extremely clear. First, to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, primarily Baku and Grozny. By depriving the Soviet Union of its main fuel artery, Germany would not only provide its military machine with a virtually inexhaustible source of fuel, but also bring the Red Army to its knees by immobilizing its tanks and aircraft. Second, it was necessary to cut off vital transport links connecting the central regions of the country with the south and capture the fertile lands of the Don and Kuban rivers to deprive the USSR of its food supply. A key point on the way to these goals was a city on the Volga River named after the Soviet leader, Stalingrad. For Hitler, the capture of this city was not only a strategic task, but also a matter of enormous ideological prestige. Destroying Stalin's city meant dealing a crushing moral blow to the entire Soviet people. Initially, as part of Operation Blau, Stalingrad was assigned a supporting role. Army Group South was divided into two parts. Group A, under the command of Field Marshal List, was to advance on the Caucasus, while Group B, which included General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Field Army, was to move toward Stalingrad to cover the flank. Of the troops advancing south, establish a blockade of the city and clear the Volgodonsk Isthmus. It was assumed that the city would be taken quickly, on the move, with a powerful blow from an armored fist. No one in the German High Command could have imagined that this city, stretching for dozens of kilometers along the right bank of the Volga, would become a giant trap for them, a place where their most powerful and victorious army would meet its inglorious end. On June 28, 1942, German troops launched an offensive. Powerful Wehrmacht tank wedges, supported by thousands of aircraft, began to break through the Soviet defenses. The first weeks of the offensive were more than successful for the Germans. The troops of the southwestern and southern fronts, weakened by previous battles and lacking sufficient anti-tank weapons, suffered heavy losses and retreated eastward, abandoning towns and villages. It seemed that nothing could stop the steel avalanche rolling across the steppe. By mid-July, the advance units of Paulus's 6th Army had reached the Great Bend of the Don River, posing a direct threat to Stalingrad. The city was in mortal danger. Realizing the seriousness of the threat, the Soviet Supreme Command acted decisively. On July 12, 1942, a new front, the Stalingrad Front, was created from the troops of the disbanded Southwestern Front. Command was entrusted to Marshal Semyon Konstantinovich Timoshenko, who was later replaced by Lieutenant General Vasily Nikolaevich Gordov. The front was faced with a virtually impossible task: to stop the enemy rushing towards the Volga at the Don River, wear it down in defensive battles, and prevent it from breaking through to the city. The 62nd, 63rd, and 64th Armies were transferred to the front and hastily took up defensive positions on the left bank of the Don. However, these armies were not in the best condition. Many divisions were only half-manned. They were desperately short of modern equipment, especially tanks and anti-tank artillery, and the defense system was being set up in a great hurry, without the necessary engineering equipment. On July 17th, the advance units of the 62nd and 64th Armies encountered the vanguard of the German 6th Army near the Chir and Simla rivers. This day is considered the official start of the Battle of Stalingrad, a battle that was to last 200 days and nights. The first battles immediately became fierce. Soviet soldiers, despite the enemy's superiority in the air and on the ground, fought with desperate courage. They understood that behind them was Stalingrad, and beyond that, the Volga, and there was nowhere else to retreat. But the forces were too unequal. German tank divisions, with their vast combat experience, bypassed pockets of resistance and surrounded Soviet units, forcing them to retreat under threat of complete encirclement. Bloody battles in the Great Bend of the Don continued until August 10th. During this time, the troops of the Stalingrad front, despite suffering huge losses, were still able to slow down the pace of the German advance, gaining precious time to prepare their defenses on the approaches to the city. They forced the enemy to pay a high price for every kilometer of ground gained. However, the situation remained critical. There was panic in the troops, with cases of desertion and abandonment of positions without orders. It was at this moment, on July 28, 1942, that People's Commissar of Defense Joseph Stalin issued his famous order number 227, which went down in history under the unofficial but much better-known name, "Not a Step Back." The document was read out to the troops in all units and subunits. It was extremely harsh and frank. It spoke of the mortal danger hanging over the motherland, and that further retreat was tantamount to death. The order demanded iron discipline and categorically prohibited retreat without orders from higher command. Any commander who abandoned his position was declared an enemy of the people. Penal battalions and companies were introduced for those who were guilty. And in the rear of unstable divisions, blocking detachments were created with orders to shoot panic-stricken soldiers and cowards on the spot. This order was an act of desperation, but at the same time, it became a powerful psychological tool. It showed the soldiers and commanders that they had no choice but to stand and die. And they stood. Unable to break through to Stalingrad across the Don Bend, the German command decided to change tactics. On August 21, 1942, the strike force of Paulus's 6th Army crossed the Don near Peskovka and launched a rapid offensive on the northern outskirts of Stalingrad. At the same time, the 4th Panzer Army, under the command of General Hermann Guderian, broke through from the south toward the city. The plan was simple: to take the city in a pincer movement and drive its defenders into the Volga. August 23rd was a black day for Stalingrad, a day that was forever etched in the memory of the survivors as an apocalypse. At 4:18 p.m. Moscow time, hundreds of German bombers appeared in the sky above the city. The 4th Air Fleet of the Luftwaffe, commanded by General von Richthofen, began the most massive and brutal bombing raid of the entire war. This was not just a tactical strike against military targets. It was the deliberate destruction of the city and its inhabitants. The first wave of planes dropped high explosive bombs to destroy buildings and tear open their wooden structures. The next waves carried incendiary bombs, which turned the city into a single roaring whirlwind of fire. The bombing continued uninterrupted for several hours, and then resumed over the next few days. The city, which consisted mostly of wooden buildings, was instantly transformed into a fiery hell. Huge columns of black smoke rose kilometers into the sky and could be seen for dozens of kilometers. The temperature at the epicenter of the fires was so high that metal melted. People burned alive in their homes, in the streets, trying to escape. More than 40,000 civilians, old people, women, children, died that day. It was one of the worst tragedies of the war, comparable in scale and cruelty to the bombings of Dresden or Hiroshima. The situation was made worse by the destruction of oil depots on the banks of the Volga River. Tons of burning oil poured into the river, and the Volga itself went up in flames. It seemed as if everything was burning: the earth, the air, and the water. According to the German command's plan, this fiery nightmare was supposed to break the will of the defenders, sow panic and chaos, and force them to lay down their arms and flee. But the effect was quite the opposite. Those who survived the bombing, seeing the charred bodies of their loved ones and their hometown reduced to ashes, felt not fear, but only fierce, burning hatred for the enemy. Thousands of townspeople, including women and teenagers, took up arms. Workers from factories, militiamen, cadets, and yesterday's school children formed militias that took up defensive positions in the streets, turning every house into a fortress. On the same day, August 23rd, the vanguard of the German 14th Panzer Division broke through the northern suburbs to the Volga River near the village of Rynok, cutting off the 62nd Army from the main forces of the Stalingrad front. The city's defenders found themselves surrounded. But instead of panic and surrender, which the Germans had counted on, they encountered fierce, unprecedented resistance. The bombing, intended to destroy the city, actually turned it into an ideal battlefield for the defenders. The labyrinth of ruins, rubble, destroyed basements, and communications became excellent shelters and firing points where small groups of Soviet fighters could hold back entire enemy battalions. The hell of August 23rd was a prologue to an even more terrible hell of street fighting. After a monstrous bombardment and a breakthrough to the Volga, the German command was confident that the fate of Stalingrad was sealed. General Paulus reported to Berlin that the city was practically in his hands, and that only a few days would be needed for the final mop-up. On September 13, 1942, the Germans began a general assault on the central part of the city. They concentrated up to 5 divisions on a narrow section of the front, which were to deliver the decisive blow, cut through the defenses of the 62nd Army, and throw its remnants into the river. Thus began the most brutal and bloody phase of the battle, the fighting inside the city. Stalingrad ceased to be just a point on the map. It turned into a giant battlefield with no front lines or rear. The war was fought for every street, every house, every floor, every basement, and even individual rooms. The Germans called this type of combat Rattenkrieg, rat war. Wehrmacht soldiers, accustomed to rapid breakthroughs in open terrain, found themselves in a completely unfamiliar and hostile environment. The labyrinth of ruins nullified their superiority in tanks and aviation. Every house reduced to ruins became a deadly trap. Around every corner, in every window, in every pile of bricks, a sniper, machine gunner, or anti-tank gunner could be waiting for them. The Soviet defenders, led by Lieutenant General Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army, developed and perfected close combat tactics. Chuikov demanded that his soldiers cling to the city and close the distance to the enemy as much as possible to prevent them from using artillery and aviation without risking hitting their own troops. The fighting was carried out by small assault groups of 10 to 12 men armed with submachine guns, grenades, knives, and entrenching shovels. These groups infiltrated German-occupied buildings through underground passages, breaches in the walls, or across rooftops, engaging the enemy in merciless hand-to-hand combat in cramped quarters. Sniping reached unprecedented levels in Stalingrad. Snipers such as Vasily Zaitsev became true legends, killing hundreds of enemy soldiers and officers. They engaged in duels lasting several days, displaying remarkable endurance and camouflage skills. The fighting did not let up for a minute. During the day, German aircraft hovered over the city, and artillery plowed every meter of ground. At night, Soviet assault groups recaptured lost positions or made daring raids into enemy rear areas. The life of a soldier in this hell was short. The average life expectancy of a private soldier in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. But new reinforcements were constantly being ferried across the Volga from the left bank to replace those who had fallen. Despite the enormous losses, the defenders of the city stood their ground to the death. They fought for the railway station, which changed hands more than 10 times in a few days, for the elevator, whose walls were pierced by thousands of shells, for every piece of land soaked with blood. The German offensive gradually bogged down in these terrible street battles. Instead of a lightning victory, they were met with an exhausting, bloody slaughter that consumed their best divisions. The city they had almost destroyed refused to die. In the center of Stalingrad, dominating the entire city and the Volga crossings, stands a hill marked on military maps as Height 102. It went down in history under a different name, Mamayev Kurgan. This hill became not just a key tactical point, but the sacred center of the entire Battle of Stalingrad, a place where the concentration of fury, courage, and death reached unimaginable heights. Whoever controlled the top of Mamayev Kurgan controlled virtually the entire city. Its slopes overlooked the central districts, the factory complex to the north, and, most importantly, the crossings over the Volga, which supplied the 62nd Army. The loss of the mound would mean certain death for the city's defenders. Both the Germans and the Soviet troops understood this with extreme clarity. That is why the fighting for this height was characterized by total, uncompromising destruction. The battle for Mamayev Kurgan began on September 13th, simultaneously with the general assault on the city. German divisions, wave after wave, rushed to its slopes. They advanced under heavy fire from Soviet artillery on the left bank of the Volga and under the dagger-like fire of machine guns and mortars of the defenders entrenched on the heights. The slopes of the mound were literally plowed up by thousands of shells, bombs, and mines. The density of fire was such that, according to post-war estimates, there were between 500 and 1,250 shrapnel fragments per square meter of land. The earth was mixed with metal and blood. Even in winter, during the most severe frosts, there was no snow on the mound. It simply melted and evaporated from the constant explosions. The top and slopes of the mound changed hands countless times. Sometimes, in a single day, the height was 6 or 7 times in the hands of the Germans, then the Soviet soldiers. Often, battles raged simultaneously on different slopes. The Germans attacked on the western slope, while Soviet soldiers held their ground on the eastern slope facing the Volga. These were not battles in the usual sense of the word. It was a relentless hand-to-hand combat where everything was used: bayonets, rifle butts, knives, and entrenching shovels. The famous 284th Rifle Division, commanded by Colonel Nikolai Batyuk, fought here. Its soldiers performed miracles of heroism. Signalman Matvey Pavlov, whose hands were blown off by a mine explosion, clamped the ends of a broken wire between his teeth and, dying, restored communications. His feat allowed the artillery to deliver a precise strike against the advancing tanks. Sniper Vasily Zaitsev fought here, destroying many of his enemies on the slopes of Mamayev Kurgan. The battles for the mound continued for 135 days, almost until the very end of the Battle of Stalingrad. In the spring of 1943, not even grass grew on its slopes. The earth was dead, burned, and littered with metal. Mamayev Kurgan became a mass grave for tens of thousands of Soviet and German soldiers. It became a symbol of superhuman strength, perseverance, and self-sacrifice. Today, a majestic monument, the Motherland Calls, stands at its summit as an eternal reminder of those who remain buried in this sacred ground, defending not just a hill, but the future of their country. The annals of military history are full of examples of the defense of great fortresses that lasted for months and years. But in Stalingrad, an ordinary 4-story residential building on 9th of January Square became a symbol of unyielding fortitude and soldierly courage. It was marked as a fortress on German staff maps. It went down in history as Pavlov's house. This building occupied an extremely important tactical position. It stood on the edge of the square, from where enemy positions approaching the Volga could be fired upon for a kilometer in all directions. From here, it was possible to control one of the few roads leading to the river, along which the city's defenders received reinforcements and ammunition. The loss of this house would have opened a direct route to the Volga bank for the Germans, which would have threatened to cut off the defenses of the 62nd Army. At the end of September 1942, a reconnaissance group of 4 soldiers under the command of Sergeant Yakov Pavlov received an order to capture this building and hold it. Upon entering the house, the soldiers found several dozen civilians hiding in the basement, as well as several wounded Soviet soldiers. After driving the Germans out of the building, the small group took up a circular defense. Soon, reinforcements arrived. A machine gun platoon led by Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev, a group of armored soldiers, and several machine gunners. The garrison of the house grew to 25 men. They were people of different nationalities: Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, Tatars, and Kazakhs. They turned an ordinary house into an impregnable fortress. The windows and openings in the walls were bricked up, leaving only narrow embrasures for firing. The fighters dug a trench connecting the basement of the house with the regiment's command post, ensuring communication and the delivery of ammunition. They set up machine guns, anti-tank guns, and mortars on different floors, creating a multi-level firing system. The defense of Pavlov's house lasted 58 days and nights. For 58 days, a small garrison repelled fierce attacks by German infantry and tanks. The Germans attacked several times a day. They shelled the building with artillery and mortars, tried to blow it up, but the defenders did not surrender. They let the tanks get close and shot them with anti-tank guns from the basement, while the infantry was cut off by heavy machine gun and automatic fire from the upper floors. At night, the fighters made sorties to obtain weapons and supplies and bury their fallen comrades. All this time, civilians remained in the basement of the house, whom the soldiers cared for, sharing their meager rations. General Chuikov later noted with bitter irony that the Germans lost more soldiers in their attempts to capture this one house than they did in the capture of Paris. Pavlov's house became more than just an important stronghold. It became a symbol, Soldiers in all corners of Stalingrad knew about its indomitable garrison. This story was passed from mouth to mouth, instilling in the fighters the belief that it was possible to survive even in the most inhuman conditions. When Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive on November 25th, the defenders of Pavlov's house were among the first to strike the enemy from the very heart of its positions. This ordinary house became a true legend, an example of how the courage and will of a few dozen people can be stronger than the steel and fire of an entire army. North of Mamayev Kurgan and the city center was the industrial district of Stalingrad. It was home to three giant factories of national importance: the Krasny Oktyabr metallurgical plant, the Barricadi gun factory, and the Stalingrad tractor plant, which had been converted to produce T-34 tanks before the war. For the German command, capturing this industrial complex was one of their main objectives. This would have allowed them not only to finally break the resistance in the northern part of the city, but also to declare the complete capture of Stalingrad, as the factories were its heart and pride. At the end of September and in October 1942, it was here, in the factory district, that the epicenter of the fiercest fighting shifted. The Germans threw fresh sapper and assault battalions into the battle, specially trained for urban combat. The battle for the factories turned into the apotheosis of the Rat War. It was no longer a battle in the ruins of residential neighborhoods. It was a war inside huge, mangled, but still standing industrial workshops. The fighting was for every machine, every beam, every span. Huge open hearth and assembly shops, with their complex system of ceilings, communications, and basements, became the scene of the most brutal and bloody battles. Here, the fighting distance was reduced to a few meters. In the semi-darkness of the gigantic rooms, littered with debris from equipment, assault groups clashed in hand-to-hand combat. German flamethrowers burned entire sections of the workshops, trying to smoke out the Soviet fighters, who responded with a barrage of fire from all types of weapons, appearing from the most unexpected places. The factories continued to operate even under fire. The Stalingrad tractor plant produced and repaired T-34 tanks just a few hundred meters from the front line. Workers, many of whom were women and teenagers, labored in workshops whose walls shook from shell explosions, finished and repaired tanks, often with crews made up of volunteer workers, went straight from the factory yard to their first and last battle. On October 14th, the Germans launched one of their most powerful attacks on the factories. More than 3 infantry and 2 tank divisions, supported by 1,000 aircraft, descended on the defenders' positions. At the cost of incredible losses, they managed to break through to the territory of the tractor plant, and in some places reached the Volga, dividing the 62nd Army's defenses into several isolated pockets. One such pocket was the group of Colonel Gorakov, fighting in the area of the village of Spartanovka. Another was the 138th Rifle Division of Colonel Lyudnikov, which found itself pinned to the very banks of the Volga on a tiny patch of land behind the Barricadi factory. This patch of land, under fire from all sides, went down in history as Lyudnikov's Island. Despite this partial success, the Germans were unable to completely capture the factory district. The defense of Krasny Oktyabr and Barricadi continued. Every workshop and every wall became an impregnable bastion. By mid-November, the German offensive had finally run out of steam. It drowned in blood and got bogged down in the endless labyrinths of industrial giants. The factories were almost completely destroyed, but not conquered. They became the steel backbone of Stalingrad's defense, while a fiery epic of street fighting unfolded on the right bank of the Volga. The river itself became the main artery feeding the agonizing but unyielding 62nd Army. For the defenders of Stalingrad, the Volga was everything. The only way to get reinforcements, ammunition, and food. The only route for evacuating thousands of wounded soldiers. For the Germans, the Volga was the last line they had to cross to close the encirclement and destroy the city's defenders. That is why the battle for Stalingrad was also a battle for the Volga. German aircraft and artillery, dominating the high right bank, kept the river and all the crossings under constant, round-the-clock fire. Every meter of the water's surface was riddled with bullets. During the day, attack aircraft and dive bombers hunted down literally every boat and every raft. At night, the river was lit up by flares, and the shelling continued unabated. In these inhuman conditions, the sailors of the Volga military flotilla and the rivermen performed an unparalleled feat. On small armored boats, tugs, seaners, and even fishing boats, they delivered everything necessary to continue the fight to the right bank under a hail of shells and bombs. Every trip across the Volga was deadly dangerous. The water in the river boiled from the explosions. The ships were hit dozens and hundreds of times, burned, sank, but stubbornly continued toward their goal. The flotilla was commanded by Rear Admiral Dmitry Dmitrievich Rogachev. His ships not only supplied the troops, but also supported the land forces with their guns, suppressing German firing points on the shore. Armored boats, nicknamed river tanks, approached the shore and fired point-blank at German positions. The crossing operated mainly at night. In complete darkness and silence, the ships approached the destroyed piers on the right bank. In a matter of minutes, under enemy fire, soldiers and workers unloaded boxes of ammunition, shells, and bags of hardtack, and carried the moaning, bloodied wounded aboard. The return journey was no less dangerous. Many ships never made it to the safe left bank, finding their grave at the bottom of the great Russian River. Things became particularly difficult when the cold weather set in and ice formed on the Volga. The ice made navigation almost impossible. Communication with the right bank was in danger of being completely cut off. But here, too, Soviet soldiers and engineers found a way out. They waited until the ice became strong enough, and until then, they delivered cargo across thin, breaking ice, crawling along and risking going under at any moment. Then, when the Volga froze over, an ice road was laid, along which vehicles could travel. The Volga became a real lifeline for the defenders of Stalingrad, similar to the one laid across Lake Ladoga for the besieged city of Leningrad. It was a symbol of the unbreakable bond between the besieged city and the rest of the country. And as long as this artery pulsed, as long as blood flowed through it in the form of new soldiers and ammunition, the heart of Stalingrad continued to beat. The Germans standing on the shore were unable to cut this thread. They could see the opposite bank, but it remained out of reach for them. While the best divisions of the Wehrmacht were being ground down in the fiery hell of Stalingrad, a drama of a different kind, an intellectual one, was unfolding in the silence of Moscow's offices and headquarters. The Supreme Command, watching the German war machine become increasingly bogged down in street fighting, came to the conclusion that a unique opportunity had arisen to launch a crushing counterattack. The plan, which began to take shape in the minds of Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky back in September, was bold, ambitious, and extremely risky. It was codenamed Uranus. The essence of the plan was ingenious in its simplicity. Instead of continuing fruitless frontal attacks in the city itself, or trying to push the Germans back from the Volga, it was proposed to deliver powerful blows to the flanks of the entire German Stalingrad group. These flanks, stretching for hundreds of kilometers across the bare steppe to the north and south of Stalingrad, were covered not by German forces, but by much weaker Allied armies, the 3rd and 4th Romanian, 8th Italian, and 2nd Hungarian. These armies were poorly armed, especially with anti-tank weapons. Their morale was low, and the soldiers were not eager to die for someone else's interests in distant and cold Russia. The Soviet command planned to break through the defenses in these weak areas with 2 converging strikes. From the north, from bridgeheads on the Don River, the Southwestern Front, under the command of General Nikolai Fedorovich Vatutin, was to advance. From the south, from the Sarpinsky Lakes area, the Stalingrad Front, under the command of General Andrei Ivanovich Eremenko, was to advance. Joining forces deep behind German lines, in the area of the city of Kalach-na-Donu, these 2 wedges were to close a giant encirclement ring, trapping the entire 6th Field Army of Paulus and parts of the 4th Panzer Army. Preparations for Operation Uranus were carried out in the strictest secrecy. The concentration of troops for the future offensive was one of the largest logistical operations of the war. For more than 2 months, entire armies were transferred at night, observing all measures of camouflage in the steppes north and south of Stalingrad. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, guns, and mortars were secretly concentrated in their starting positions. To deceive the enemy, demonstrative preparations for an offensive were carried out on other sections of the front. Engineers built false crossings and tank parks, and intelligence spread disinformation. The German command, including Paulus himself, knew about the concentration of Soviet troops on their flanks. However, they catastrophically underestimated its scale. They were convinced that the Red Army was exhausted by fighting and capable only of local counterattacks to weaken the pressure on the defenders of Stalingrad. They could not imagine that the Soviets had enough strength for an operation of such strategic scope. Their attention was still focused on the ruins of the city, where they continued to throw their last reserves into battle, trying to crush the defenders. By mid-November, everything was ready. A powerful strike force had been assembled. The weather worsened, with snowfall and fog setting in to conceal the start of the offensive and deprived the Germans of their main advantage: air superiority. An ominous calm hung in the air. The steel trap was ready to snap shut. November 19, 1942. Thick, piercing fog and icy sleet enveloped the snow-covered Don steppe. This weather, unsuitable for aviation, was the signal for the beginning of the Great Revenge. At 7:30 in the morning, the silence was broken by a deafening roar. For 80 minutes straight, thousands of Soviet guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers spewed fire and steel at the positions of the 3rd Romanian Army northwest of Stalingrad. It was one of the most powerful artillery strikes of the entire war. When the wall of fire rolled deep into the enemy's defenses, tanks and infantry from the southwestern and Don fronts went on the attack. For the Romanian soldiers, freezing in their poorly equipped trenches, it was a real shock. Their defensive positions were swept away in the first few hours. Those who survived the artillery barrage fled in panic or surrendered. Meeting no organized resistance, Soviet tank corps rushed forward, breaking through deep into the rear of the German group. The next day, November 20th, the offensive began on the southern flank. After similar powerful artillery preparation, the troops of the Stalingrad front attacked the positions of the 4th Romanian Army. Here, the resistance was somewhat more stubborn, but it was quickly broken. Mechanized corps rushed north to meet the tankers of the southwestern front. The German command at the headquarters of the 6th Army did not initially realize the full scale of the disaster. They received panicked reports from the Romanians, but considered it a local breakthrough that could be closed by transferring several tank divisions. But it was already too late. Soviet tank wedges moved at breakneck speed, bypassing pockets of resistance, cutting communications, and sowing chaos in the enemy's rear. The main target of the attackers was the city of Kalach-na-Donu and the bridges across the Don River in its vicinity. The capture of Kalach, where the main rear bases and warehouses of the 6th Army were located, would mean its complete isolation from supplies. On November 22nd, the vanguard of the 26th Tank Corps captured the strategically important bridge across the Don near Kalach at full speed, preventing the Germans from blowing it up. It was one of the most daring and brilliant episodes of the operation. On the same day, the distance between the advancing claws was reduced to a few dozen kilometers. The agony of the 6th Army began. On November 23, 1942, at 4 p.m., in the area of the Soviet farmstead southeast of Kalach, the advance units of the 4th Tank Corps of the Southwestern Front and the 4th Mechanized Corps of the Stalingrad Front met. Tankers, covered in frost and gunpowder smoke, jumped out of their vehicles, hugged each other, and cried with joy. The steel ring of encirclement closed. 22 divisions and more than 160 separate units of the 6th Field Army and part of the 4th Tank Army found themselves in a giant cauldron. According to various estimates, a total of between 250,000 and 330,000 enemy soldiers and officers were surrounded. It was the greatest disaster in the history of the Wehrmacht. Operation Uranus, prepared in secret, was carried out with incredible speed and efficiency. In just 4 days, Soviet troops not only broke through the front, but also created a giant cauldron, turning the tide of the entire battle for Stalingrad. The news that an entire army, the Wehrmacht's best army, had been trapped sent Hitler's headquarters into shock. The generals on the ground, including Paulus himself, soberly assessed the situation and realized that the only chance of salvation was an immediate breakout from the encirclement to the southwest, toward the main forces. The 6th Army still had the strength to do this, and, most importantly, fuel supplies. However, Hitler categorically forbade a breakout. For him, the loss of Stalingrad, the city named after his arch-enemy, was unthinkable. He gave the fateful order: "The 6th Army will remain in Stalingrad and wait for the blockade to be lifted. I order you to hold the front at all costs." The decisive argument that convinced the Führer that it was possible to hold the fortress of Stalingrad was the assurance of the commander of the Luftwaffe, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring. He arrogantly promised that he would be able to organize an air bridge and supply the surrounded army with everything it needed by air. Göring swore that his transport planes would deliver at least 500 tons of cargo to the cauldron every day, the minimum amount necessary to maintain the Army's combat capability. In reality, this promise turned out to be a complete failure. Soviet aviation and anti-aircraft artillery, which had created a tight blockade around the cauldron, launched a veritable hunt for German transport planes. The slow and poorly armed Junkers 50s were easy prey for Soviet fighters. The weather was also against the Germans. Constant blizzards and fog prevented the planes from taking off. As a result, an average of no more than 100 tons of supplies were delivered to the encirclement per day, and sometimes nothing at all. Instead of food and ammunition, the surrounded army was often sent useless cargo, such as tons of spices or propaganda leaflets. Paulus's soldiers began to starve. Meanwhile, the German command was feverishly preparing a counterattack. Army Group Don was formed under the command of one of the Wehrmacht's best strategists, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. His task was to break through the Soviet encirclement from the outside and link up with Paulus's army. The operation was named Wintergewitter, or Winter Storm. On December 12, 1942, Manstein's powerful tank force, consisting of elite SS divisions, launched an attack from the Kotelnikovo area in the direction of Stalingrad. At first, the offensive was successful. German tanks, including the latest Tigers, broke through the Soviet defenses and rushed toward the encircled army. It was a critical moment in the entire Battle of Stalingrad. The distance between Manstein's group and Paulus's army was reduced to 48 kilometers. It seemed that salvation was near. Manstein radioed Paulus, urging him to launch a counterattack codenamed Thunderbolt. But Paulus, bound by Hitler's order to hold out to the last and lacking sufficient fuel for his tanks, hesitated. He requested direct permission from the Führer to break through, but received another categorical refusal. This delay proved fatal. The Soviet command quickly transferred the Second Guards Army under the command of General Rodion Malinovsky to the breakthrough area and launched a powerful counterattack against Manstein's advancing units. In fierce fighting on the Mishkov River, the German offensive was halted and then pushed back to its starting positions. By the end of December, it was clear that Operation Winter Storm had failed. The last hope for the salvation of the Sixth Army was extinguished. The fate of those surrounded was sealed. After the failure of Manstein's relief operation, the situation of the Sixth Army surrounded in Stalingrad became completely hopeless. The cauldron turned into an icy hell. The harsh Russian winter set in, with temperatures reaching -30 degrees and piercing steppe winds. Soldiers, dressed in summer uniforms, as the summer campaign was supposed to end before the cold weather set in, froze to death en masse. Starvation and cold were compounded by epidemics. Typhus, dysentery, and scurvy raged in the overcrowded, unsanitary basements that served as hospitals. The lack of medicine and qualified medical care meant that any injury was fatal. The daily ration of a soldier was reduced to 100 grams, and then to 50 grams of bread, baked with wood shavings and a plate of liquid horse meat soup. The army ate all its horses. Cases of cannibalism began. The once high morale plummeted to zero. Soldiers and officers, abandoned by their high command to certain death, lost all faith in victory and salvation. Their only desire was to survive. However, they continued to fight, obeying orders and maintaining discipline, which in itself was a manifestation of incredible fortitude. The Soviet command, having completely blocked the pocket, was in no hurry to storm it. It methodically tightened the encirclement, conducting constant artillery fire and air raids. Powerful loudspeakers set up on the front-line broadcast calls to surrender in German around the clock, interspersed with funeral music and news of the Red Army's victories on other fronts. It was a powerful psychological war, undermining the already broken spirit of those surrounded. On January 8, 1943, in order to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, the Soviet command presented General Paulus with an ultimatum. He and his army were offered an honorable surrender. All those who surrendered were guaranteed life, safety, normal food, and medical care, as well as the preservation of their uniforms, insignia, and personal belongings. After the end of the war, they were promised a return to their homeland. Paulus, realizing the hopelessness of his situation, asked Hitler for permission to accept the ultimatum. The response from the Führer's headquarters was predictably short and harsh. Surrender is out of the question. The army will fulfill its historic duty to the last soldier. After receiving the refusal, the Soviet command gave the order to begin the final phase of the battle, an operation to completely destroy the encircled group. Hitler, condemning his army to death, pursued a cynical goal. He wanted the Sixth Army to tie down Soviet troops at Stalingrad for as long as possible, preventing them from advancing in other directions. In addition, he craved a heroic myth. An army that died but did not surrender in the city of Stalin was supposed to become an example of Aryan self-sacrifice for the entire nation. But the soldiers in the icy trenches of Stalingrad no longer wanted to be heroes. They wanted to live. The agony of the Great Army was coming to its terrible end. After the ultimatum to surrender was rejected, the Soviet command had no choice but to proceed with the violent elimination of the Stalingrad cauldron. On January 10, 1943, troops of the Don Front, under the command of General Konstantin Rokossovsky, began an operation codenamed Ring. It was preceded by a powerful hour-long artillery barrage. 7,000 guns and mortars rained down a barrage of fire on the positions of the encircled troops. Immediately afterwards, infantry and tanks went on the offensive. Despite extreme exhaustion, hunger, and cold, the remnants of the Sixth Army put up desperate, though hopeless, resistance. They clung to every line, every hill. However, the forces were too unequal. The Soviet troops, which outnumbered the enemy several times over in manpower and equipment, methodically broke through the German defenses. The offensive was conducted from west to east, with the aim of cutting off the Germans from their last operational airfields, such as Pitomnik and Gumrak, through which meager supplies were being delivered. The battles for these airfields were particularly bloody. Having lost them, the encircled army lost its last, even illusory, hope of salvation. The territory occupied by the Germans shrank with each passing day, like shagreen leather. By January 17th, it had been reduced by half. Soviet troops reached the outskirts of the ruined city. Now the fighting moved back to the very ruins that had been so fiercely contested in the fall. Only now the roles had changed. The Germans were defending, and the Soviet soldiers were attacking. On January 24th, Rokossovsky, seeking to avoid unnecessary casualties on both sides, again offered Paulus to surrender, but again received a refusal. After that, the Soviet offensive resumed with renewed vigor. On January 26th, in the area of Mamayev Kurgan, troops of the 62nd Army, advancing from the east, from the city itself, joined forces with units of the 21st Army advancing from the west. This blow cut the encircled group in two. The southern group, which was larger in number, found itself trapped in the central part of the destroyed Stalingrad. At its center, in the basement of the central department store, was the headquarters of the 6th Army, led by Paulus. The northern group, commanded by General Karl Strecker, was blocked in the area of the barricade and tractor factories. The agony of the remnants of the 6th Army reached its peak. They were almost out of ammunition, food, and medicine. Resistance was now sporadic. Individual groups of soldiers, huddled in basements and ruins, fought to the last bullet, or simply waited for their fate. Command of the troops was completely lost. Operation Ring was nearing completion. Soviet troops were preparing to deliver the final blow to end the enemy's agony. The end of January 1943. The southern group of German troops, trapped in the center of Stalingrad, was a cluster of exhausted, starving, and frost-bitten people. Resistance had practically ceased. On January 30th, Hitler made a last desperate attempt to avoid the shame of surrender and turn the tragedy into a heroic myth. He radioed Friedrich Paulus and promoted him to field marshal. The calculation was cynical and simple. There had never been a case in German history of a field marshal surrendering. In this way, the Führer was unambiguously hinting to Paulus that he should commit suicide. He wanted his commander to take his own life, preserving the honor of his uniform and setting a precedent for future generations. But Paulus did not want to become a dead hero. He chose life, even if it meant captivity. He saw the futility of further resistance and did not want to condemn the remaining exhausted soldiers to death for the sake of the Führer's insane idea. On the morning of January 31st, Soviet officers from the headquarters of the 64th Army descended into the basement of the department store where the headquarters of the 6th Army was located. Paulus's chief of staff, General Schmidt, told them that they were ready to stop fighting. Soon, the newly minted field marshal, broken and sick, was taken prisoner. This was an unprecedented event. A field marshal of the great German army had surrendered to the enemy. On the same day, the southern group surrendered completely. However, the northern group, under the command of General Strecker, entrenched in the ruins of the factory district, continued its senseless resistance, obeying Hitler's last order. The Soviet command concentrated all its artillery fire on them. On February 1st, a fiery whirlwind descended on the remnants of Streicher's troops. On February 2nd, 1943, unable to withstand the blow, they too surrendered. The great battle on the Volga, which lasted exactly 200 days and nights, was over. The scene that met the Soviet soldiers was horrific. Tens of thousands of German soldiers and officers were trudging to assembly points for prisoners. These were no longer the arrogant conquerors who had come to this land in the summer. They were shadows, frostbitten, emaciated, in rags, barely able to move their legs. In total, more than 91,000 soldiers were taken prisoner during Operation Ring, including 24 generals and the field marshal himself. Around 140,000 enemy soldiers were found dead in the cauldron. The fate of the prisoners was tragic. Due to extreme exhaustion and disease, only a few of them, about 6,000 people, survived captivity and returned home after the war. The victory was complete and unconditional. The news of the defeat at Stalingrad shocked Germany. A 3-day mourning was declared in the country. The myth of the invincibility of the Wehrmacht was dispelled forever. For the Soviet Union and the whole world, this victory became a symbol of courage, steadfastness, and the inevitability of the coming defeat of Nazism. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Silence reigned on the banks of the Volga, broken only by the howling wind in the ruins of the dead city. The price paid for this victory was monstrous. The Red Army's losses during the entire battle, including the defensive and offensive periods, amounted to more than 1,100,000 people killed, wounded, missing, and captured. The losses of the Axis countries, Germany, Romania, Italy, and Hungary, were also enormous, estimated at approximately 1.5 million people. The Battle of Stalingrad became one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The city itself was practically wiped off the face of the earth. 90% of the housing stock was destroyed, but the sacrifices were not in vain. The victory at Stalingrad had a huge, game-changing impact on not only the Great Patriotic War, but the whole Second World War. First, the myth of the invincibility of the German army was finally dispelled. The Wehrmacht lost its best and most experienced divisions on the Volga, which it was unable to replace. This was a crushing blow to the military power and morale of Nazi Germany, from which it never recovered. Second, the victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a radical turning point in the war. The strategic initiative passed definitively and irrevocably into the hands of the Soviet command. From then on, the Red Army would mainly be on the offensive, liberating its land and moving westward toward Berlin. The defeat of German troops on the Volga forced them to begin a hasty retreat from the Caucasus to avoid being surrounded again. The threat of the capture of the Baku oil fields was removed. In January 1943, partly thanks to the diversion of German reserves to Stalingrad, the blockade of Leningrad was broken. The victory also had enormous international significance. It strengthened the anti-Hitler coalition, showing the whole world that the Soviet Union was capable of defeating the enemy's best forces on its own. The Allies, the United States, and Great Britain intensified their military efforts. In Germany's satellite countries, such as Romania, Hungary, and Italy, anti-war sentiment grew, and the search for ways out of the war began. Neutral Turkey, which had been waiting for the right moment to attack the USSR, finally abandoned its aggressive plans. Stalingrad became more than just the name of a city. It became a global symbol, a symbol of unyielding courage, fortitude, self-sacrifice, and national heroism. It showed that strength of spirit, love for one's homeland, and willingness to die for freedom can prove stronger than even the most perfect military machine. In the ruined but unconquered city on the Volga, the backbone of the Wehrmacht was broken. Here began the road to the great victory, which would end in May 1945 in defeated Berlin. The memory of the defenders of Stalingrad, of those who stood to the death in the icy trenches, who perished in the fiery hell of street fighting, will forever remain in history as an example of the greatest feat in the name of life and the future of humanity.